My name is Julie, and this is the story of how my life was upended not once but twice. To make sense of it all, I'll start from the beginning. I grew up in a small suburban town with my loving parents, Larry and Joanna David. Dad was a journalist and Mom worked as a nurse. We weren't wealthy, but we had everything we needed and were content. Life was ordinary and peaceful until I turned 14. That's when everything shifted. It was a rainy Friday night, and my parents were on their way back from a dinner party. I was at home with my grandmother, laughing at some silly cartoon, when the phone rang. I'll never forget the chill that ran through me as I overheard my grandmother crying softly in the kitchen. The days that followed felt like a foggy nightmare. They told us Mom had died instantly in the crash, while Dad barely clung to life. When I finally saw him at the hospital, he was a shell of the strong, confident man I had always known. His legs were shattered, and the doctors said he would never walk again. "Julie," he whispered hoarsely, reaching out for my hand. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry." I couldn't understand why he was apologizing. It wasn't his fault. A drunk driver had plowed into their car. But as time went on, the weight of his words started to make more sense. As I got older, I began to understand what my dad had meant that day in the hospital. He wasn't apologizing for the accident itself, but for how our lives had changed, for the challenges we'd have to endure, for the mom I'd lost, and for the father he felt he could no longer be. But my dad, Larry David, was far stronger than he believed. After leaving the hospital and adjusting to his new life in a wheelchair, he poured himself into his work. Writing had always been his gift, and he channeled all his energy into his role as an editor at the city's leading newspaper. During my teenage years, Dad made sure I had everything I needed. He encouraged me to join clubs, make friends, and live a normal life. But in truth, I cherished spending time with him more than anything else. We bonded over classic movies, debated about books, and he was always there to help me with my schoolwork. When the time came for college, Dad insisted I go away for school. "You need to spread your wings, kiddo," he told me with a smile.
Don't worry about me.
"I'll manage just fine." I was reluctant to leave him, but I knew he was right. So I packed my bags and headed to the State University of New York to study accounting. That's where I met Emma, who would change my life in ways I never expected. Emma quickly became my closest friend, and through her, I was introduced to her second cousin, Paul. Paul was warm, funny, and incredibly understanding. When I opened up to him about my dad, he didn't hesitate or act awkward. In fact, when he finally met Dad, the two hit it off immediately, bonding over their mutual love of classic rock. Later, Paul told me with a grin, "Your dad is awesome, and you're incredible for everything you've done for him." I tried to shrug it off, but deep down, his words made me feel something I hadn't felt in years: hope. For the first time since the accident, I dared to imagine a future that included love, happiness, and maybe even a family of my own. After graduating, life started to come together like pieces of a puzzle. I landed a job at the local tax service, and Paul began his career as a long-haul truck driver. We dated for 4 wonderful years before he proposed during a crisp autumn evening in the very park where we'd had our first date. I was overjoyed, but I needed to set one thing straight. "Yes, Paul," I said with a smile, "but I can't leave my dad. He needs me." Paul's face lit up as he replied, "I wouldn't have it any other way. We'll all live together. Your dad's apartment is big enough for the 3 of us, right?" His understanding melted my heart, and soon after, we began planning the wedding. The wedding was small but beautiful, just the way I had always envisioned it. Dad insisted on wheeling himself down the aisle to give me away, a gesture that left not a single dry eye in the room. As I stood at the altar, holding Paul's hand, I felt like I was stepping into a real-life fairy tale. But like every fairy tale, mine had its villains, and they came in the form of my mother-in-law, Maria, and my sister-in-law, Olivia. From the very first meeting, it was clear they didn't approve of me. "So, your father is handicapped?" Maria asked, wrinkling her nose as if something unpleasant had entered the room. "He's disabled," I corrected her calmly, trying to keep my composure. "But he works as an editor?" How nice, she interrupted, her disinterest glaringly obvious. Then she turned to Paul and said, "Are you sure about this? There are so many nice girls out there from good families." Embarrassment and anger burned through me, but Paul didn't miss a beat. "Mom," he said firmly, "Julie is from a good family. Her dad's disability doesn't change that. I love her, and that's all that matters." Maria fell silent, but her eyes still carried that unmistakable disapproval. Olivia, following her mother's example, was just as cold and distant. After the wedding, Maria's attitude didn't improve, and Olivia continued to treat me with icy indifference. True to his word, however, Paul always stood by my side. After the wedding, Paul moved in with Dad and me, and we quickly settled into a comfortable rhythm. I worked at the tax office during the day, while Paul spent long stretches on the road for his trucking job. When he was home, we cherished our time together, sharing meals with Dad and enjoying the little moments that made us feel like a family. But everything changed whenever Maria and Olivia came over. Their visits cast a shadow over our home, as they treated it like their personal domain while barely acknowledging Dad. Once, I overheard Maria whispering to Olivia, "It's such a shame. Paul could have done so much better. Now he's tied down to this girl and her crippled father. Can you imagine if they had kids? Think of the genes." Her cruel words ignited a fury in me, but I swallowed my anger for Paul's sake, desperate to maintain some semblance of peace. However, their contempt was wearing me down. One evening, after an especially tense visit from Maria and Olivia, I couldn't hold it together any longer. I broke down in tears in our bedroom. Paul found me sitting on the edge of the bed, sobbing. Hey, he said gently, pulling me into his arms. "What's going on? What's wrong?" "Your mom and sister," I managed to choke out. "They hate me. They think I'm not good enough for you because of Dad." Paul's expression darkened, his jaw tightening with determination. "That's ridiculous," he said firmly. "You and your dad are my family now. If they can't accept that, it's their problem, not ours." His unwavering support was the comfort I desperately needed. Paul's words reassured me that evening, but deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that our troubles with Maria and Olivia were far from over. As the months passed, Paul's trucking business began to thrive. He was constantly on the road, traveling across the country in his big rig. I missed him terribly during his long absences, but I threw myself into my job at the tax office and spent my evenings keeping Dad company. One crisp autumn evening, as I was helping Dad get ready for bed, my phone rang. It was Paul, his voice buzzing with excitement. "Julie, I've been thinking," he said, his tone lively despite the static over the line. "How would you feel about us buying a townhouse? It'd be easier for your dad to move around in his wheelchair, and he could spend more time outside. Plus, you could have a garden, something to keep you busy when I'm on the road." As he spoke, I couldn't help but smile. The idea had so much potential. I glanced over at Dad, who was doing a terrible job of pretending not to eavesdrop. "What do you think, Dad?" I asked, putting the call on speaker, so he could join the conversation. Dad's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "A garden would be lovely," he admitted, "and it would definitely make it easier to get outside." His excitement sealed the deal. Over the next few weeks, we dove headfirst into house hunting, searching for the perfect place to call home. The anticipation of this new chapter filled us with hope and renewed energy. We finally found the perfect place, a spacious townhouse with wide doorways, a roll-in shower for Dad, and a beautiful backyard. Taking on a mortgage felt daunting, but with Paul's income, my salary, and the rent from Dad's old apartment, we managed to make it work. Moving day came on a bright and sunny Sunday in spring, and I'll never forget the expression on Dad's face as he wheeled himself onto our new patio. "This is perfect, sweetie," he said softly, his eyes misty with emotion. "Thank you." The next few months were spent settling in and making the house truly ours. I started a small vegetable garden, while Dad loved spending hours outside, soaking up the sunshine and fresh air. Life felt peaceful, almost perfect. Wanting to celebrate our new home, we decided to host a housewarming party. We invited friends, colleagues, and, of course, Maria and Olivia. The party was lively and full of laughter when they finally arrived, fashionably late as always. As they stepped inside, I noticed their barely concealed envy as they took in the house. During the tour, Maria seemed unusually quiet, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. When we reached the master bedroom, she turned to me with a sly smile. "You know, Julie," she said quietly, a calculating tone in her voice. "This would be perfect for Paul and me," Maria said with a smug smile. "Why don't you send your father to a nursing home? Then I could move in here." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. "Excuse me?" I managed to choke out, barely believing what I'd just heard. Maria waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, don't look so surprised. Your father isn't well. He's not whole anymore, is he? He doesn't need all this luxury. A nursing home would be perfectly adequate for someone in his condition." I stood there, stunned and furious, struggling to find words. Before I could respond, Maria turned on her heel and marched out to the patio, where Dad was chatting with some of the guests. To my horror, she grabbed the handles of his wheelchair and started pushing him toward the driveway. "Maria," I shouted, sprinting after her. "What are you doing?" "If he won't go to a nursing home, he can stay outside," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "That's what you wanted, right? For him to get fresh air?" I was trembling with anger and disbelief when, thankfully, Paul heard the commotion and came running. The moment he saw what was happening, his face turned bright red with rage. "Mom," he shouted, his voice like thunder. "What the hell are you doing? Let go of Larry's chair right now." Maria froze, startled by Paul's furious tone. "But honey, I don't want to hear it." Paul cut her off sharply. "You and Olivia need to leave now," Paul said, his voice trembling with restrained anger. Maria and Olivia left in a flurry of awkward silence, their protests falling on deaf ears. Once the door shut behind them, Paul turned to us, his face filled with regret. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I had no idea she would do something like that. I'm just so sorry." Dad reached over and placed a reassuring hand on Paul's. "It's not your fault, son," he said gently. "Some people just don't know how to see the bigger picture." After that incident, life shifted into a new normal. Maria and Olivia kept their distance, which was a relief for all of us. Paul threw himself into his work, taking on more long-haul routes to help pay for our home. I divided my time between my job at the tax office, maintaining our house, and caring for Dad. The years passed quickly, and our lives settled into a steady, predictable rhythm. Paul was away most of the time, but when he was home, we cherished every moment. Dad's health remained stable, and he spent his days enjoying the garden or working on editing projects from his desk. We had found a sense of peace. Then everything changed. I was at work one afternoon when my phone rang. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar. "Mrs. Walker, this is Officer Andrew with the Highway Patrol," the man said. My heart sank into my stomach. "Yes," I whispered, barely able to speak. "I'm sorry to inform you that your husband, Paul Walker, has been in a serious accident." The officer's words echoed in my ears, but they hardly registered. Phrases like head-on collision and didn't make it floated around me, but they felt like they were coming from far away. It wasn't until I heard myself murmuring a thank you to the officer and hanging up that the reality began to sink in. Paul was gone. The days that followed were a haze of grief and numbness. I moved through the motions of planning the funeral like a machine, my mind barely comprehending the decisions I was making. Everything felt surreal. The day before the service, I mustered all my strength and decided to call Maria. As much as I dreaded the conversation, I felt she deserved to hear about her son's passing directly from me, not from an obituary. When she answered, her voice was sharp. "Hello." "Maria, it's Julie," I said, my voice trembling. "It's about Paul. He's gone. There was an accident." There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought she had hung up. Then her voice returned, low and venomous. "This is your fault," she hissed.
Her words struck me like a slap.
Maria, You made him work so hard, she interrupted, her voice rising. Driving that truck, paying for your fancy house. You killed my son. I was stunned, struggling to form a response. Maria, Save it, she snapped, cutting me off. I expect you to give him the best funeral money can buy. That's the least you can do. Her cold, cutting words left me speechless. Don't expect a penny from us. You made your bed, now lie in it. With that, the line went dead. I stood there, still holding the phone, tears streaming down my face. How could Maria be so heartless? How could she blame me for something so tragic and beyond my control? The day of Paul's funeral arrived, cloaked in gray skies and steady rain, a reflection of the heaviness in my heart. The church was filled to capacity. Paul had been well loved, and it seemed like half the town had come to say goodbye. But as I stood at the front, greeting mourners offering their condolences, I realized that Maria and Olivia were nowhere to be seen. They hadn't even bothered to attend their own son and brother's funeral. Dad, sensing my sadness, reached out and gave my hand a comforting squeeze. It's their loss, sweetie, he said gently. We're family, and we'll get through this together. Later that day, as we pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed something strange. The house lights were on. I frowned, sure I had turned everything off before we left. Did you leave any lights on, Dad? I asked, glancing at him. He shook his head. No, I don't think so. As we got closer, I noticed movement inside the house. My heart started pounding. Was someone inside? Were we being robbed? On the very day of Paul's funeral? The moment we pulled into the driveway, I quickly helped Dad out of the car and into his wheelchair, my mind racing. Should I call the police? But as we approached the front door, familiar voices reached my ears, sending a chill down my spine. I froze, recognizing them instantly. Summoning my courage, I pushed open the door. There they were, Maria and Olivia, standing in the middle of my living room, surrounded by boxes and pieces of furniture. My grief was momentarily replaced by sheer outrage. What the hell is going on here? I demanded, my voice sharp and trembling. Maria turned to me, her expression painted with a mask of insincere sympathy. Oh, Julie dear, she said sweetly, we're just helping you pack up. After all, you can't possibly afford to keep this house now that Paul is gone. I stood there, stunned into silence, but Olivia chimed in, her tone sickeningly sweet. Don't worry, you can move back to your father's apartment. It's cozy. The rage inside me boiled over. Get out, I said, my voice low and firm, shaking with fury. Get out of my house.
Right. Now.
Maria looked at me with feigned indignation, as if I were the one in the wrong. This house belongs to us now, she declared. All of Paul's property does. We're his family, after all. Like hell you are? I shouted, unable to contain my anger any longer. Where were you today? At his funeral? Oh, that's right. You didn't even bother to show up. Bother to show up, I said, my voice shaking with anger. Maria waved her hand dismissively. We were busy making arrangements. Now be a good girl and start packing. We'll give you until tomorrow. I stood there, stunned, unable to believe the audacity of these women. They hadn't shed a single tear for Paul, hadn't even come to his funeral, and now they were trying to force us out of the home Paul and I had built together. My shock quickly turned to resolve. I'm calling the police, I said, pulling my phone from my pocket. Maria and Olivia exchanged uneasy glances, clearly not expecting me to push back. Now, Julie, let's be reasonable. Maria began, but I cut her off. No, I said firmly. You have exactly 10 minutes to get out of my house before I call the cops. This is my home. Paul and I bought it together, and you have no right to be here. There must have been something in my tone or the look in my eyes because they both suddenly realized they'd overplayed their hand. Maria and Olivia begrudgingly gathered their things, muttering under their breaths. As Maria stepped through the door, she turned back to me with a sneer. This isn't over, Julie. You'll be hearing from our lawyers. I slammed the door behind them, shaking with fury and heartbreak. The days following Paul's funeral were a whirlwind of grief, anxiety, and endless paperwork. I threw myself into managing Paul's affairs, partly as a distraction and partly out of fear. I knew Maria and Olivia weren't bluffing. They would try to make good on their threats, and I needed to be ready. Continued. Open the file on his desk. Now, as I mentioned on the phone, your husband came to see us to draft his will. He was very clear about his wishes. I held my breath, my heart pounding in anticipation. Why hadn't Paul told me about this? What exactly had he planned? Mr. Thompson adjusted his glasses and continued. First, he wanted to ensure that his wife, Mrs. Walker, retained full ownership of the townhouse you both shared. He was explicit that this property should remain in your name, free from any claims by other family members. Relief washed over me, and I could feel tears forming in my eyes. For the first time since Paul's passing, I felt like I could exhale. Additionally, Mr. Thompson went on, he left a modest financial inheritance to help with any future expenses for Mr. David's care. He was very clear about how much he respected and cared for his father-in-law. Dad's eyes glistened as he gave my hand a gentle squeeze. That's just like Paul, he said softly, his voice tinged with emotion. Finally, Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair and smiled reassuringly. Mrs. Walker, your husband's careful planning ensures that no one, not even his biological family, can challenge these arrangements. Everything is legally airtight. For the first time in weeks, a sense of calm settled over me. Paul had taken steps to protect us, even in his absence. Maria and Olivia could threaten all they wanted, but they would have no legal claim to our home or Paul's assets. I left the office that day with a mix of grief and gratitude. Paul might have been gone, but his love and foresight were still safeguarding the life we had built together. Mr. Thompson's voice was steady as he began to read aloud from the document. I, Paul Walker, being of sound mind, do hereby leave all my worldly possessions to my beloved wife, Julie Walker. I gasped softly, and Dad's grip on my hand tightened in silent support. This includes our home, my truck, and all our savings, Mr. Thompson continued. It is my wish that Julie use these resources to care for herself and her father, Larry David, whom I have come to love as my own. Tears streamed down my face, blurring my vision. Even in death, Paul was looking out for us, ensuring we'd be safe and cared for. I wiped my cheeks, my heart aching with both sorrow and gratitude. There's more, Mr. Thompson said gently, breaking the heavy silence. He reached for an envelope and handed it to me. Mr. Walker left a personal letter for you. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. The familiar handwriting brought a fresh wave of emotion as I began to read. My dear Julie, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I'm so sorry for leaving you and Larry. Please know that you two are the best thing that ever happened to me. I made this will because I know how my mother and sister can be. I didn't want to worry you, but I needed to make sure you and Larry were protected if anything happened to me. You're my real family, Julie, you and Larry, not them. Take care of each other, live your lives to the fullest, and know that I'll always be watching over you. All my love, forever.
Paul.
By the time I finished reading, I could barely see through my tears. Paul's love and thoughtfulness shone through every word, wrapping me in a sense of comfort I hadn't felt since he passed. He was gone, but his presence, his care and devotion, was still with us, guiding me and Dad as we faced the uncertain road ahead. All the arrangements, Maria said, her voice dripping with false kindness as I approached the house. I had barely stepped out of the car when my eyes locked on her sleek sedan parked by the curb, Olivia standing stiffly beside her on the porch. My heart sank for a moment, but this time, I wasn't afraid. I reached into my pocket, feeling the comforting presence of Paul's letter. His love, his thoughtfulness, and his unshakable devotion gave me the strength to face whatever they were about to throw my way. Julie, Maria began as Dad and I rolled up the driveway, her tone syrupy but laced with condescension. We need to talk about the arrangements for Paul's estate. I stopped a few feet away from them, my chin held high. "There's nothing to talk about," I said firmly, cutting through her pretense. "Paul already made all the arrangements." Maria's fake smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Julie, let's be reasonable.
Paul would have wanted us to be involved.
After all, we're his family." "Are you?" I shot back, my voice steady. "Because you weren't at the funeral. You didn't shed a tear for him. And now you show up here, again uninvited, trying to claim what doesn't belong to you?" Olivia crossed her arms, glaring at me. "We have a right to what's ours." "No, you don't," I said, pulling Paul's will and letter from my pocket. "Paul made sure of that. This house, his belongings, his savings, they're mine. And he left specific instructions that you have no claim to any of it." Maria's face darkened. "You think a piece of paper will stop me?" she hissed. "You'll hear from my lawyer." "Go ahead," I replied coldly. "Paul's lawyer ensured that everything is airtight. You have no legal standing. Now, get off my property before I call the police again." Maria glared at me for a long moment before finally turning on her heel, muttering under her breath. Olivia followed, shooting me one last venomous look. I didn't care. This time, I didn't feel fear or doubt, only the unshakable certainty that Paul had done everything in his power to protect us. As their car sped off down the street, I turned to Dad, who gave me a proud smile. "We're going to be okay," I said, more to myself than anyone else. And for the first time since Paul's death, I truly believed it. Seeing it in Paul's own handwriting made the dream feel even more real and unbearably bittersweet. My fingers brushed over the words, my heart aching with the weight of what could have been. The weeks after our meeting with Mr. Thompson had been consumed with settling Paul's affairs. It was overwhelming at times, but having something to focus on helped ease the rawness of my grief. When the insurance payout finally came through, it was just as Mr. Thompson had promised, enough to pay off our mortgage with a substantial amount left over. It was a relief, a gift from Paul that reminded me once again how much care he had put into ensuring our well-being. One quiet afternoon, as I sorted through Paul's desk, I came across a small notebook tucked into a drawer. Intrigued, I opened it and found page after page filled with his familiar, messy handwriting. It was a journal of sorts, filled with thoughts, ideas, and dreams he had for our future together. Thinking about starting a college fund for our future kids. One entry read, "Want to make sure they have the best start in life." Tears welled up as I read the words. Paul and I had often talked about having children someday, imagining what our family might look like. Seeing it written down, in his own hand, brought a sharp pang of longing and an overwhelming sense of love. Even in his private thoughts, he had been planning for us, for a life we'd never get to live together. As I closed the notebook and held it to my chest, I made a silent promise. I would honor Paul's memory by living the life he had dreamed for us. Even though he was gone, his love and vision for our future would guide me every step of the way. My life. My heart pounded as I stared at the small plastic stick, willing the result to appear. When the little screen finally changed, I gasped. Positive. I sank onto the bathroom floor, clutching the test in my hands, my emotions swirling in every direction. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered, "Oh, Paul." A fresh wave of grief and longing hit me, but it was mixed with something else. Hope. In that moment, I felt Paul's presence so strongly, as though he were there beside me, smiling that same reassuring smile I had seen in my dream. It was as if this was his way of telling me that everything truly would be all right. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. I was carrying a piece of Paul, a part of him that would live on. It was bittersweet, the joy of this new life tangled with the pain of his absence. But as I sat there, I made a vow. I would do everything in my power to give this child the life Paul had dreamed of for them. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. I told Dad, who wept openly when I shared the news. "This is Paul's gift to us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's like he's still here, watching over us." Though the road ahead was uncertain, I felt a newfound strength growing within me. Paul had left us with more than memories. He had left us with a future, one that I would cherish and protect with all my heart. Ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of light piercing through the darkness. This baby, Paul's baby, was a symbol of everything we had shared, a piece of him that would always be with me. Dad's words stayed with me as we sat in the kitchen, talking and making plans. He poured me a glass of orange juice, insisting I sit down while he whipped up something to eat. "You've got to take care of yourself now," he said with a gentle smile. "That little one is counting on you." I placed a hand on my stomach, the reality starting to sink in. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was building something new, something beautiful, out of the love Paul and I had shared. The thought filled me with purpose. I didn't know what the future held, but I was determined to honor Paul's memory by giving this baby the best life possible. As I looked at Dad, his eyes shining with pride and support, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. We had each other, and we had this incredible gift Paul had left behind. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Dad," I said, my voice steady but emotional. He reached across the table and took my hand. "You'll never have to find out, sweetie. We're in this together." And with those words, I felt a quiet strength building inside me. This was a new chapter, a hard one, yes, but also one filled with hope. With Dad by my side and Paul's love guiding me, I knew we could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Believe what I was hearing. Maria and Olivia, who had shown me nothing but disdain, who hadn't even attended Paul's funeral, were now standing on my porch asking for my help. The audacity of their request left me momentarily speechless. I folded my arms over my growing belly, steadying myself before responding. "You want to stay in my father's apartment?" I asked, my voice calm but laced with disbelief. Maria nodded quickly, her usual haughty demeanor replaced with an edge of desperation. "Just for a little while," she said. We've had some financial setbacks, and we have nowhere else to go." Olivia added, "We wouldn't ask if we weren't out of options." Her eyes darted away, unable to meet my gaze. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to slam the door in their faces, to remind them of every cruel word and selfish act. But another part of me, the part that Paul had loved, paused. Despite everything, I thought about what he would want me to do. "I'll think about it," I said finally, my voice steady. "But you need to understand something. If I agree to this, there will be boundaries. You will respect my father, my home, and most importantly, my child. If you can't promise me that, then the answer is no." Maria and Olivia exchanged glances. "Of course," Maria said quickly, her tone almost pleading. "We'll respect your rules. We just need a place to stay." I nodded, my hand still resting protectively on my belly. "I'll talk to my dad about it. You'll have my answer in a few days." As they left, I stood on the porch, watching their car disappear down the street. I didn't know if I could trust them, but I did know one thing. I would never let anyone, not even them, jeopardize the safety or happiness of my family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything Maria and Olivia had put us through, they now had the audacity to ask for more. I took a steadying breath, keeping my voice firm but calm. "I'm sorry, but that's not possible," I said. "I don't want any further communication with either of you." Maria's eyes narrowed, and her gaze dropped to my growing belly. Her face twisted with shock and disgust. "You're pregnant," she spat, her tone dripping with venom. "Already? You little prostitute. I can't believe you've already found another man. Paul's body isn't even cold in the ground." A surge of anger rose in me, but I forced it down. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose my composure. I didn't bother explaining that the baby I carried was Paul's. I didn't want my child to have a grandmother or an aunt like them. Instead, I met her glare with a small, knowing smile, one that seemed to rattle her even more. "My personal life is none of your concern," I said, my tone calm but resolute. "Now, I think it's time for you to leave." Maria looked like she wanted to lash out further, but something in my expression must have stopped her. She pressed her lips into a thin line and turned sharply on her heel, yanking Olivia along with her. I stood on the porch, watching as their car disappeared down the street. A wave of peace washed over me, lightening the burden I had been carrying. I had stood my ground, protected my family, and maintained my dignity. Paul would have been proud, and for the first time in a long while, I felt proud of myself too.